the panel, which is, let's say, it's titled Conceptualizing Vigilantism, and hopefully gives us a kind of a starting of the several discussions that are timely and important to the study of vigilantism. Today we'll start with the first presentation by Melina Kalfelis. Melina is a postdoc who's working currently at the Cultural and Social Anthropology Department of the University of Bayreuth. And she researches vigilantism, trust, and violence in the Sahel. She has been working also as a fellow at the Cluster of Excellence, which is called Africa Multiple in Bayreuth, and at the German Institute of Global and Area Studies. And also in the Marian Institute for Advanced Studies in Africa in Ghana. Beyond that, I should also mention that Melina is a photographer also and a filmmaker, and her documentary NGO Crossroads has been officially selected by the Science Film Festival of 2020. So I recommend anyone to have a look at that or get in touch with Melina if you want to get a hold of that documentary. Having said that, I think it's time now to give the floor to Melina with her presentation, Vigilantism as Process, Reconsidering Violence Through the Politics of Koglweogo Self-Defense Groups in Burkina Faso. The floor is yours, Melina.
Thank you so much. I will just start the presentation. Okay, can you hear me and see the presentation? Okay, yes. Great. So thank you very much again for inviting me. I'm very honored and excited to be able to present my latest research on vigilantism in Burkina Faso. The presentation will more focus on the development of a theoretical argument, and as this is still a work in progress, I would be very happy to have your comments and ideas about what I'm going to present. I will start with a brief vignette and some general observations I have made on violence in Burkina Faso before I introduce the political context. So around noon, when people are hiding from the heat, the traffic at the Koglweogo space sometimes tapers off. Situated in a district outside of Ouagadougou, cut off from electricity and water supplies, the group members may lay down on a mat or buy a big plate of free sauce for themselves and the prisoners. Others may use the time to have a chat or ask me, the white anthropologist hanging around day after day, about Europe. During these few moments, the terror as usual in Yamtenga appears almost fictional. It is usually not long, however, before a great press of visitors keeps the Koglweogo busy again. Teenagers bringing water and food to an imprisoned friend who has broken into a house, witnesses and relatives waiting to negotiate over a conflict about a fraud committed by a neighbor, and fathers delivering supplies to their drug addict sons. The simultaneity of desperate stories, grievances, and suffering that culminate at the Koglweogo space can be very overwhelming. It indicates a social demand to be shielded from crime, but also the staggering ongoing infliction of harm within communities. Being with the Koglweogo is sometimes like looking in the mirror of a conflict-ridden society, one that has to bear the fruits of a state incapable to protect its citizens' rights. Burkina Faso has been known for two things: for being one of the poorest countries in the world, and for being the country with one of the most peaceful histories in post-colonial Africa. It is particularly the latter image I would like to challenge in this presentation. I would argue that violence in its most routinized and modest forms has always had a silent but all-encompassing presence in Burkina Faso. Behind the shallowness of the term poverty, different types of violence remain misrecognized and intangible, but they are nevertheless real. Every day there is state violence and hunger, land theft, gender discrimination, police abuse, fraud, robberies, all perpetuated by how institutions respond to and deal with crime and injustice. The harm they cause limits people's capacities to achieve or even imagine better life circumstances, keeping them in a permanent state of tension. However, while the research in Africa tends to focus on vigilantism in relation to state authority, I found the phenomenon in Burkina Faso more closely related to forms of violence embedded in the social interactions between people who are deeply familiar with each other. Violent routines, it seems, have shaped patterns of everyday life in Burkina Faso, routines that keep deepening people's fundamental doubts about the world's social fabric. This paper states that the Koglweogo, both men and women, are those people. The different types of violence I've just described have been a formative part of their life worlds, providing them with the basis for becoming vigilantes in the first place. Against this background, I propose a processual approach to the study of vigilantism as a violent motion within violent motions. I argue that vigilantes do not only use violence, they navigate, shift, and disrupt violent routines in everyday life. In my research, violence thus becomes a lens and a tool to challenge the habitual blindness towards people's violent pasts, presents, and futures, which also means to study vigilantism in an intersubjective space in which different types of violence frame, interrupt, and change the social processes of interaction. So I will now give a brief introduction to the political context of the research, and then I will present some epistemological considerations that led me towards the processual approach. And in the last section, I will deal with the particular event of mob justice and touch on some analytical avenues a processual approach might take in this context. So after the popular insurrection against the 30-year rule of former President Blaise Compaoré in 2014, Burkina Faso's good reputation, which I mentioned earlier, started to crumble. The regime's collapse had unleashed a wave of extremism and violence, which is why the country today is one of the main stages of a cross-regional conflict zone in the Western Sahel. Parallel to these events, in 2015, the Koglweogo self-defense groups mushroomed nationwide. Their main agenda is to fight against thievery, banditry, and petty crime by catching and punishing alleged delinquents. Most units have their own prisons and realized mediations during which they gather alleged victims, accusing persons, witnesses, relatives to negotiate guilt and proper compensation. In public, the Koglweogo's physical punishments quickly drew attention. They caused an international outcry and led to accusations of human rights violations. To outside observers, there was little doubt that the Koglweogo were an inescapable evil in an African country that was slipping into political chaos, and that their violent means would inevitably be leading to the most horrifically violent ends. More recently, however, reporting on vigilantism in Burkina Faso has decreased. While terrorism still poses a significant threat, the groups are today a less controversial force in society and have managed to establish a tense but peaceful position within the state, even though they have always refused to be institutionalized formally. So in many regions, informal collaboration between the Koglweogo and law enforcement exists. Meanwhile, the groups are more and more evolving into a hybrid between vigilantism and social work. Apart from mediating conflicts and fighting crime, they are increasingly engaged in the reintegration of drug addicts into society and other related social problems. So I will continue now with some epistemological reflections. Every time I return home from the Koglweogo's twilight zone, I have difficulties in locating myself in the rich anthropological literature on vigilantism in Africa. It drew my attention to sorcery, the state, and security, which are all important elements to consider, but also nudged me towards particular questions. Especially the aspect of security drew my attention to how the Koglweogo would turn out in the future, about how they compare to the state, or why people use their service although they fear them. I won't be able to go too deep in these reflections, but as time went by, I realized that most of those questions I was occupied with were ultimately questions about violence and the legitimacy of violence. These questions concern the legitimate authority to use force, the violence I might witness myself in the field, the question, whose experiences should count in regards to violence when we look at vigilantism in post-colonial Africa. Violence, hence, was omnipresent in my research on the methodological, the epistemological, and the empirical level. But even more, I realized it was the main source of the biases that shaped my thinking. Even though I observed the Koglweogo to be acting in the midst of the little violences produced in the structures, habituses, and mentality of everyday life, their violence somehow outwit people's less visible violent experiences. So, adopting a claim from Randall Collins, I drew the following conclusion for myself. Symbolic violence is easy to overlook, real violence is hard to forget. Deeply disturbed by this deadlock, I decided to offensively tackle the problem by making violence the main tool and a lens to study vigilantism in Burkina Faso. I looked for ways to make all types of violence shaping the phenomenon more visible, without letting questions about its legitimate and illegitimate forms cloud my analysis too much. And this is how I ultimately also started to lean towards the Manchester School of Thought. In the end, it is also media coverage on the Koglweogo that clearly shows vigilantism and violence are inextricable. However, as I've tried to argue, some types of violence have been more silenced in more post-colonial Africa than others. A processual approach is useful because it makes us address silenced and recognized types of violence as a complex mix of order, anti-order, and non-order, while explicitly providing a detailed depiction of the specific and the explosive mixture of the contestable and the unquestioned in our analysis. In this way, a processual approach not only assumes an etiology of everyday violence, nurturing vigilantism in Burkina Faso. Even more importantly, it shifts the focus onto the multiplicity of audiences, temporalities, emotions, and interpretations that culminate in the Koglweogo's violent events. From this angle, finally, moral standards and legitimate ideas about violence remain ephemeral and changeable. So to illustrate how I apply a processual approach, I will briefly present a situation the Koglweogo in Yamtenga retold to me. I wasn't present myself. So when I arrived in Yamtenga on the 1st March 2019, the Koglweogo seemed very distracted. I was curious and asked the vice president what was going on. He explained that 2 thieves had ambushed a woman in bright daylight. Neighbors had witnessed the attack. Some of them wanted to call the police, while others opted for the Koglweogo. A fight broke out. In the meantime, some people formed the mob and started to pounce on the thieves, shackling them and then deciding to fetch a can of petrol to burn them alive. However, someone had already called the Koglweogo in the meantime. When they arrived, they pacified the mob and took the 2 delinquents into their custody. So in this situation, different violent routines, acts, and experiences converge. As time is short, I will only briefly present some avenues the analysis might take. In the following, I will make visible 3 violence-related processes that deserve analytical attention in the situation. Then I will carve out how this angle informs a more sensitive approach to understand the Koglweogo's practices. So first and foremost, in the event, we find processes of brutalization in everyday life. The first violent act, which is the robbery itself, had clearly touched a nerve because of its unconcealed manner in bright daylight. This blatancy of doing harm is why citizens in Burkina Faso speak of a moral breakdown, and why the Koglweogo's conflict mediations are not only investigatory trials, but also moral engines through which the community works towards new moral equilibriums. Secondly, different temporalities of violence are overlapping. Past experiences with the state, for example, strongly inform the conflict between the witnesses and the way they deal with the attack. However, the situation also makes us think about the event as a figuration of the future, especially in regards to the impunity people are confronted with in Burkina Faso since decades. Their reaction is a loud statement, one that is supposed to discourage future crimes and to create new contingencies. Thirdly, the situation also mirrors ongoing negotiations about proper reactions to crime and violence in the situation. The plan to burn the thieves indicates shifting thresholds of violence in everyday life and changing ways on how crime is handled. e.g. from avoidance to compensation, or also from the infliction of pain to even taking the life of a person. So by paying attention to these different processes culminating in the situation, I argue that we need to analyze vigilantism as a violent motion within violent motions. In Burkina Faso, the phenomenon grounds in social barriers that have been reached and the harm people do to each other on a daily basis. Most definitely, the state in its incapacity to protect citizens plays a crucial role in this regard. However, the Koglweogo understand their violence not in relation to the state. Much more, they see themselves as a necessary evil that disrupts violent routines in order to repair sociality and trust, which we will see if this is really going to work. It is also against this background that I consciously chose a situation in which it is not the Koglweogo, but other community members who use the physical violence. One story that is rarely told is that vigilantes not only hunt down criminals and hurt them, I also saw them protect people from the revenge of others. From this angle, vigilantism is also about emotions. Anger, envy, fear, guilt, and shame shape violent experiences and situations in Burkina Faso, as well as at the Koglweogo space. Their conflict mediations, hence, often also seem as outlets of pent-up emotions. This leads me to my conclusion. A processful approach to vigilantism assumes a multi-directedness of violence and the emotion it triggers. It dissolves the state-non-state binary and questions depictions that frame the Koglweogo as the ultimate violent force in people's life worlds. In other words, vigilantism, how I see it, not only enacts violence, but navigates and negotiates different types of violence in everyday life. A processual approach, hence, focuses on how vigilantes change and disrupt the way violence occurs on a day-to-day basis in Burkina Faso. It looks at how vigilantism disturbs channels and procedures through which violence is dispersed, to and against whom violence is directed, under what conditions and by what means it is used, as well as where, when, and by whom it occurs. A processual approach studies how vigilantism shifts thresholds of violence, reshapes its contingencies and consequences. Vigilante groups like the Koglweogo, in other words, wrestle with the who, the how, the when, and the why of violent routines. Following this analytical path also enables us to better understand why vigilantism unfolds explosive impacts and often violent ends. On the one hand, such actors disturb some powerful states of affairs in the post-colonial context, a long-enduring status quo of so-called peacetime crimes. On the other hand, such groups emerge as an easily manipulable, violent routine in their own right, one that is prone to use its pathways towards violence to capture political power, to move socially upwards, and to enforce their own moral convictions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Melina, for this wonderful start of the panel and of the workshop as a whole. Very fascinating, insightful, and I'm sure there are a lot of questions, but first we will continue with the other presentations. Up now is actually a duo, two presenters. The first one, Naomi van Stapele. Naomi is a lecturer at the Inclusive Education Department at the Hague University of Applied Sciences. And her current research projects explore urban education and economic empowerment in informal settlements in East Africa. And she has conducted a lot of research with social movement, gangs, sex workers, and other actors of local governance in informal settlements in East Africa and also in Kenya. The second presenter, or the other part of the duo, is Laurens Bakker, who's an associate professor at the Department of Cultural Anthropology at the University of Amsterdam. who works and has worked a lot on resource conflicts and the role of non-state militias in Indonesia, but currently also often in tandem with Naomi, has worked on conflicts in other places, for instance, in Nigeria, in a comparative fashion. We are very happy to have both of them here for this presentation, and I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, and we're very excited to be part of this workshop and already learning a lot. We set out in this paper, we're exploring the concept of vigilant relationalities, and see how it allows us to capture particular modalities of securing the local in Kenya and Indonesia, especially during times of COVID. For one of the reasons is that COVID presented a time of heightened vigilance in the parts that we were working with, the groups and in the regions that we did this research for the past 5 years. And this heightened sort of quality of vigilance also translated to a constant renegotiation of relationalities. And with relationalities, with vigilant relationalities, we explore whether it allows us to bring in view specifically the context-bound interactions and so on between what are predominantly described as state and non-state actors and residents, and then of course with all the complexities involved here, which engender possibilities to act vigilantly. And we phrase this because many of our interlocutors would say to act vigilantly and oppose that to violence. So that might already speak in a very interesting way to the previous presentation. And then this regards or this connects to some forms of popular legitimacy, even if these are highly provisional, as also our cases will reveal. And then the second, which especially in the Kenya case is very, comes even stronger to the fore, is how these context-based or context-bound interactions and so on are also imbued themselves with vigilance. And our interlocutors described vigilance as being alert, fear, and full of suspicion, as the security providers involved are also often considered insecurity providers. And now we're referring to the three actors or groups of actors that I mentioned earlier. So the sort of the state, non-state actors and residents, but of course there are many more actors involved, but we tend to now focus on these specific, the relationalities between these actors who are also often considered insecurity providers by each other in the very locality or region they collaborate to secure. So it's a very complex mixture, as already also came out in the previous presentation, between different actors. And in a sense, relationality also refers not just to relationships, but how positions are co-constituted. So we hope that we can make a case for how this notion of vigilant relationalities allows us to explore, for instance, scale, stability, and status. So with scale, we mean, for instance, in the Kenya case, we're actually talking about a what can be considered a hyperlocality. So it's about 1 mile squared, and in Indonesia, in that case, it's a far larger region actually. But it may also bring to the foreground the quality of the relationship. So is it stable or not? Now in the Kenyan case, you will see that these relationships that are co-constituted are highly volatile. And then we also talk about the status, so how groups and actors regard each other and are also regarded in broader society, and how that affects these vigilant relationalities, especially when it comes to visibility and invisibility. So I've been working with groups that are dominantly considered gangs in Kenya for about 15 years now. And as long as that period, I've also heard this phrase, in Sheng, which is the local creolized language based on Swahili and other vernaculars, it's pronounced as Kuarada ni Kuamwanauma. To be alert is to be a man, and is very much an expectation ascribed to young men, which is also affirmed by them, especially between a certain age bracket. So it's related to localized notions of age sets, and we can come back to that. But right now, let's just take that for granted for sake of the conversation. So many of these groups are organized, they're loose groups, they call themselves bases, provide security in specific parts of their neighborhoods, and they're also engaged in criminal activities, youth group activities, and they would describe themselves as acting vigilance, or acting vigilant, or being vigilant, but they would not call themselves vigilante groups, which has a very specific history of Mungiki in this neighborhood. And the next presentation will be about Mungiki, so I'll leave the explanation here. But it's a good, this group is called Uprising, but they're easy. They're like in this neighborhood, there are about 10 of these groups, and it's just to remind you, it's about 1 square mile. So it's very, very local, locally based groups. And they are simultaneously targeted, and they partner with killer police squads, such as the infamous Pangani 6, and the leaders have Pangani 6 on speed dial. So it's already here, we can see a very tenuous relationship. So, and interestingly, this is both known and not known locally, and they kind of navigate this not unknown, being not unknown. That's how they actually phrase it in Sheng. So it's not unknown, but it's not really known. So if and how they collaborate with this and other police units, and sometimes it becomes known, as they would say it, twice the word known, if a certain police killing, for instance, can be traced back to them, then this has led to many conflicts with other groups in the region, in Mavara and beyond, as recent as 3 weeks ago, and it's actually still ongoing. So during the first lockdown, which was late March last year, crime surged because the local economy tanked drastically and very rapidly, and many youth younger than 18 were suddenly home from school, and this had never happened, without warning so abruptly. So one of the youth that I do research with them on a weekly basis, because we do community-led research and action with these groups, and he explains to me, the only way to get some money now is to go out and rob people. And locally, robbing or stealing from people is considered crime, and maybe selling drugs is not really considered crime, even though it might be considered illicit. And through local informers, many of these teenagers were put on death lists. So, and from April, the Pangani 6 started to execute youth as young as 15, 16. So when one teenager, he was 16, who lived in the neighborhood of Uprising, was killed, his mother approached Uprising, and so the group talked to Pangani 6, and they agreed to remove all the teenagers, all under 18, from the list, the death list, and in return, they started to recruit these youth, because at the same time, NGOs came in, and so, for instance, UN Habitat provided all these handwash stations, and they were given a small stipend, and so these youth were sort of incorporated and therefore also kind of disciplined by Uprising in doing all kinds of community services, but also security provision, selling drugs, no stealing. So there you can see that distinction again. And then the police also agreed, so we'll reduce our extortion rackets, because that's what they took, of course, corona measures, and this is known in many areas, urban informal settlements worldwide, is that the police, of course, also took advantage of the corona measures for their own extortion rackets. So the police also reduced that. Now, the Uprising was enabled to increase its security services. The police could claim success because crime was reduced, and residents, including the informers, saw their teenagers who are usually against uprising also saw their teenagers involved in community services, and thieves from outside the neighborhood were warned not to enter. Then tragedy happened. So 2 long-standing members, actually 1 leader from uprising, were killed by police from Pangani in February this year. And right away, clashes ensued. So all the bases united together with many other residents against the police, and it was an all-out war. Then military police came in, a curfew was installed, and actually it erupted again a couple of weeks ago. And again, as recent as this weekend, another curfew was installed violently by police. And then one of the leaders from uprising told me, so when you work with police, you have to be rada, vigilant. So there's this notion of vigilance, which they constantly use in their own language, called rada. Residents can't know, and police can turn on you just like that. So here you can see how vigilance is also imbued in these relationships. We need to work with them to scare off thieves and give us space to do our work. And here they refer to drug dealing, but we're also enemies. So what was interesting is that actually the sort of ghost-like quality of the relationship, so the opaqueness, and they use the term ghost themselves also to refer, for instance, to these death squads that mark these situated vigilant relationality. So meaning, how the state is also inside these groups, so informers, but also so residents many are also informers, but also that this group that are considered outlaws are also part of state activities and so on, and the other way around. So of course there's also a lot of criminal collaborations between police and these groups. And then, as I mentioned, further complicated by all these various positions of residents at large, became temporarily clear, and still are. That's why I put it in present tense, because it's still ongoing through this act of brutal police violence. So the situated vigilant relationalities here suddenly seem to be momentarily suspended, replaced by what they themselves refer to as antagonistic relationalities. So they've become enemies. So right now they would refer to police as government or gava, but now they referred to the police as adui, which is enemy. There's a very clear divide now. It's more tangible between, let's say, the sufferers from the ghetto vis-a-vis the police at this moment. The suddenly tangible or locatability of the positions in these antagonistic relationalities has inhibited all actors involved to act vigilantly. So now you can see also that violence has become illegitimate in the eyes of many, and as a result, crime has surged. So, and now I will give the floor to Laurens to continue. And Laurens, just tell me when to switch slides. So, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Naomi, and good afternoon, everyone. Basically, of course, we're making a comparison between Kenya and Indonesia, and with a view to time, I'll try and be fairly limited because, well, I could tell you a lot about Indonesia, but I'm just not going to at the moment. Suffice to say that Indonesia is home to a large number of local security groups, some of whom consider themselves to be vigilantes. Most go by name of societal organizations. Literally, there are hundreds, perhaps thousands across the country. Most of those are quite regional. A handful is national, and among those, there are a couple who claim that they are international. The one that I've taken as example here is a group called Brigade Manguni. They're from Manado, which is in the north of Sulawesi, which is, if you like, a region, but they have chapters throughout many places of Indonesia based on migrants from the area, which have moved to other places. What is important to know is that they are a majority Christian group. And of course, Indonesia is majority Muslim. Well, this group came to the fore around early 2000s. They formed as a group to counter the threat of jihadi terrorists and jihadi insurgencies, which were taking place in some parts of Indonesia at the time. That was for a brief period. They then continued to legitimate their existence as an organization that helps to secure the area, secure mostly Manado and environments. First, because of the ongoing threats of jihadis, but now as terrorists. Second, by taking care of, well, you give them a job working on the bus, working on the streets, becoming local security guards, and so on. And if they don't want to have a job, then you tell them to behave. If they don't behave, you beat them up and you hand them over to the police, and going on from there. So basically, Manado is a fairly safe city these days. They've capitalized on this fact of keeping out jihadis and working as intelligence to government by establishing better or good relations with authorities. And one of the elements that came from this is that they have entered it into a memorial of understanding with the Ministry of Defense in countering terrorism. So they are an organization that stems out of society, but they have some serious official connections by now. Can we have the next slide, Naomi? And those connections work in a number of ways. Well, I mentioned that they put themselves forward as people who secure society, who protect the population, and this is important because their support comes from the population. So if they do things that the population would not like, yeah, they would lose support, they would become less influential towards government. Whereas as long as the population supports them, they have a voice and they can actually get things done, be an active entity in the field of security and in other fields that leads from it. And of course, this leads to all sorts of interesting practical consolations. One of those is, to mention here, perhaps, is something that happened recently in the province of East Kalimantan, where they also have a chapter. The gentleman you see on the far left is the head of the chapter in East Kalimantan. The other two guys are members of the military. They're in conversation here. But what happened is that there were two police officers in East Kalimantan, highly corrupt, quite disliked by quite a lot of shop owners. And they complained, amongst others, to Brigade Manguni and to the head of police. The head of police said, well, I can't really do anything. But Brigade Manguni told the shop owners, well, we can beat them up, actually. That might teach them a lesson. But of course, you cannot just beat everybody up out of nowhere. So the head of Brigade Manguni discussed this with the head of police, and they decided, yeah, that will teach him a lesson, but keep it a bit out of the picture. So these were plainclothes members of Brigade Manguni beating up the officers while they were off duty, did not get into the newspapers. Officially, nobody knew what had happened. In practice, it was quite clear. And that meant that here Brigade Manguni showed itself to be kind of like a successful intermediator in establishing justice, if you like, in a way that would otherwise probably not have been possible. And this is one of the ways, as I said, that does not get seen. What gets more seen specifically these days is how they help society. And one of the examples you see down there, this is a large group of members of Brigade Manguni distributing all sorts of materials required to fight COVID in government clinics. Government was quite slow in doing that. Brigade Manguni had a far quicker way of obtaining the materials and distributing them. And of course, that gets into the newspapers and that gets shared on Facebook and so on. Can we have the next slide, Naomi? But of course, those are two ways of helping. Importantly is, of course, as I mentioned, that they are a Christian organization, which does not always go down very well with more militant Islamic groups, specifically because they make such a point of acting against jihadism. And quite recently, during the lockdown, one thing that happened was that a mosque, between brackets, because it wasn't an official mosque as yet, in the Minahasa was destroyed by an angry mob. And that angry mob is supposed to have existed from members of the local population who were annoyed by the noise and the illegality of the place, and by members of Brigade Manguni. What happened is, of course, that out of other parts of Indonesia, there came serious anger, serious threats to act against Brigade Manguni, basically because they were being put in the picture as terrorists who or committed crimes against the Islamic community. And while this was going on, interestingly, this discussion became national with various Islamic organizations as well as ethnic groups speaking out on behalf of Brigade Manguni, as well as the police, the Ministry of Religious Affairs speaking out on their behalf, showing the kind of support, if you like, that this local security organization could muster in more political spheres. Can we go to the next one? So basically, these were a couple of examples, but what we like to put on the table here is this interesting interplay between these various groups, which first off Naomi identified in the beginning. We have these security groups, we have officialdom, the police, government, and we have the local community. And the interplay between these three main actors, and as said, there are quite a few more, brings to the fore these interesting relationalities, if you like, within which vigilantism plays a role and is given a specific shape. And that shape refers to skill, with the hyper-low kill that's Naomi described, of the square of the one street, basically, the more regional, as I tried to show very briefly with the example of Manado, but the international context in which that gains a meaning. The stability of these groups, we have not said that much about, but it is quite important to take into account. In the case of Brigade Manguni, coming to the fore in the 2000s as an anti-terrorism group, then evolving into a societal organization, if you like, then evolving to a national group, then evolving into a group closely affiliated with government, and so on and so forth. If you can't evolve, if you can't develop yourself, if you can't guarantee stability, you're not going to work very well as a vigilant organization. And finally, status, and this is important as well. If you are too associated with crime, for instance, the local population won't like you very much, and that won't work for you. If you are, in the Indonesian case, too much associated with governments, population will also consider you to be something that is not there for their benefit. You need to balance these various associations, interests, to come to the fore and build yourself a status that is both based on a type of legitimacy and a type of local dependability and trust. And I think that I will be by the end of our time for now. So happy to talk more, but I'll shut up for now. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Laurens and Naomi. I think it was a beautiful continuation of some of the themes that we saw in Melina's presentation, also adding a number of layers actually to some of the points that were made in the first presentation. So thank you very much already for doing that kind of interesting groundwork for our discussion. The next presenter was in a way already introduced a little bit by Naomi. Not by name, but by a topic. The next presenter is Jacob Rasmussen, who is an associate professor in the International Development Studies at Roskilde University in Denmark. And Jacob has focused on urban politics, youth and violence in Africa, also in Kenya mostly. And he has written on vigilantism, gangs, human rights, grassroots activism, and transnational migrant networks. I am very happy to be able to give the floor to Jacob, whose presentation is titled Parasitic Agency, Conceptualizing Vigilante Relational Actions vis-à-vis the State. I give the screen to you, Jacob.
Yes, thank you very much, Martijn, and thank you, Melina, Naomi, and Laurens, for the nice images you've had to your presentation. A few weeks ago, I saw a brilliant presentation without PowerPoint, so convinced that I thought, hey, this is the way to go for me. And now I'm getting second thoughts. So sorry about that. But it's nice to know that behind all your initials, at least I know a few familiar faces. So anyway, you'll see me dancing here. A while ago, I came across a graffiti. It was like man size, and it read, "Human beings are parasites." And it was placed in a context of climate change anxiety and protest for environmental awareness, and it critiqued man's overuse and exploitation of global resources. So basically, it's saying human beings are set to prey on Earth like a biological parasite. And it reminded me of my previous analytical attempts at explaining this Kenyan vigilante movement, Mungiki, where I tried to present them as parasites. It's a Kikuyu-dominated movement, and they describe themselves and their vigilant practices, both violent and political, using a metaphor of the mugumu tree. It's a parasitic fig tree. So it's a fig tree that grows on another tree, a host tree. And this tree is sacred in Kikuyu mythology, and it's considered the tree of life amongst the Kikuyu. So back then, I was inspired by Mungiki's use of this emic term. And I used the parasite as an attempt at making a grounded theory to explain exactly Mungiki's abilities to transform their asymmetrical relation to the Kenyan state and their violent practices. I mean, it's a violent practice to cling on to another host being and kind of suck the life out of it. So that's how I tried to use it. And in this paper, I'm trying to revisit this decade-old work. And what I'll try to do is to conceptualize, generally speaking, vigilante actions, beyond Kenya, beyond Africa, to make a more general claim, so that we can understand vigilante agency through this notion of parasitic agency. And even though it's maybe an old and tried argument for me, turning it somewhat on its head and making this broader claim, that's a new thing for me. I've mainly conducted small, situated, ethnographically informed analysis of local, local practices. So I hope you'll kind of play along, or if you don't, then shoot it down and I'll leave it here forever, right? So there's a considerable literature that explores state vigilante relations, and much of it has rightly moved beyond these instrumentalized understanding of the asymmetrical relation. So that it's not just a question of patron and clients, and it's the most powerful who can rule the vigilantes. Actually, vigilante groups has a lot of agency, and we've seen that in the previous presentations, right? And another central realization in much vigilante literature concerns the ability of vigilante movements to transform or move between different kind of, whether they're acting as social movement, providing service provision locally, and so forth. We've also seen that in the two previous presentations. So what I find lacking a bit in the general literature is conceptually unfolding the qualities of vigilante agency. How can we actually make sense of it? And what I try to argue is that this notion of parasitic agency contributes to that. So the 4 elements. So first, I briefly resurrect, in analytical terms, the Mungiki movement to exemplify, their actions and their relations to Kenyan politicians. Secondly, I will unfold the idea of the parasite. And thirdly, I try to very briefly situate this idea of parasitic agency in the literature on vigilantism and agency. I mean, this will be indicative, so it's very superficial and far from exhaustive. And finally, I give a few examples, and maybe I borrow a bit from both Melina and Naomi and Lawrence's presentations to give examples of maybe the applicability of parasitic agency beyond Kenya. So first, Mungiki, it's a Kenyan vigilante group. Their name in Kikuyu means multitude. They had an ongoing, violent, constantly changing relation to the Kenyan state. In some instances, they have been employed by the state for violent actions, especially during the post-election violence in 2008 and 2009. Allegedly, they killed or being associated with more than 100 killings, 200 killings, right? At other times, Mungiki has used their violent potential against state actors, against certain politicians, and again, in other times, secret police death squads, similar to the ones Naomi was talking about, they have systematically targeted Mungiki. So this violent relation constantly change over time. At the same time, Mungiki has provided public services like water, electricity, security to the public. So there are also questions of their legitimacy and shifting roles, right? They've gained economically from these relations to politicians or state actors. So they have been given the control over public transport routes and so forth. They've, in different ways, they were some of the key witnesses in the International Criminal Court that at The Hague against the now president of Kenya for the violations in 2008 and 2009. So they've been quite central in Kenyan politics. So that is the basis. This is it's from this movement that I first encountered this idea of the parasite, right? So that was the grounded aspect. This is the empirical stuff that informed, that alerted me to the idea of the parasite, the way they describe their own actions, this constantly changing relation to the state, their violent ability that they were laughing about. We're like the mugumu tree. We were like this tree that feeds on others. That's how they sometimes describe themselves. But for the conceptual part, I'm inspired by the French philosopher Michel Serres, who has a book called The Parasite. And I kind of used it as a philosophical resource for theoretical inspiration. And Serres uses the parasite as a grand metaphor for human relation. And he merges notions of politics, mythology, to describe how the parasite, challenge and change existing orders, produce new ones, right? In French, it has three meanings. The word parasite, it's a biological parasite, it's a social parasite, and it's a static. It's only the two first that is captured in the English translation. So the first, the biological parasite, Serres described as a microbe, an insidious infection that takes without giving and weakens without killing, right? There's a lot of violence in that. The social parasite, that's a guest who exchanges his talk, his praise, his flattery for food. Serres is using the folk tale of the town rat and the country rat, so that the rat that comes in and visits, and so it's slightly funny in that sense, right? And the last one, the static, that is noise, or it's an interference in the system. That's the French version. I mainly use the first one, the biological parasite, but I keep the other two at the back of my mind. So what happens here? It's a symbiotic relationship between parasite and host. It reveals the transformative aspect of parasitism, where the biological parasite is not free of the host once it has entangled. Rather, the host is subsumed and becomes part of a new collective body. Together, the parasite and the host merge into a new and different whole. And it's through this parasitic process that the normal flow of things, the existing order, is interrupted and something new appears, right? So using that as a metaphor for how vigilante movements in their relation to state through their violent practices actually informs change in society. So that is briefly, but you see the characteristics of these parasitic processes. It's like interruption, inherently violent takeover, relational asymmetry, yet an interdependence, right? And I think this is really, it captures some of the key aspects of what the vigilante literature is about and all the empirical examples. So at least that's, to me, what is kind of intriguing. So moving on to some of the literature, largely vigilantism is categorized as groups who try to reassert moral or legal orders, often using violence or force. But of course, it doesn't mean that vigilante movements are homogeneous or static. Rather, they're often heterogeneous, transformative, and their actions and the perceptions of them, as we also see in the call for this workshop, it blurs the boundaries of crime and policing. It blurs the boundaries between public service and extortion, between organized political actors and more kind of dispersed networks that are more loosely organized, right? So this heterogeneity and the transformative characteristic means that vigilante groups can appear as anything. We've seen it, social movements, criminal gangs, policing units, even political parties in one form or the other, while at the same time having security-related concerns or moral norms about safety and society at the core of their activities, right? And it's these qualities, of course, are not realized in a vacuum. They have a relational and contextual dimension to them. So this is where the concern for moral, legal, and social order about state and society comes out. And this is where, the literature on neo-patrimonialism, as I mentioned before, it has tendency to maybe diminish the agency of vigilante groups by making it instrumental and almost entirely strip vigilante groups of agency, and also they tend to emphasize only the violent potential of vigilante agency and not the transformative potential or the other activities that potentially can legitimize their action. Somewhat at the other end of a continuum of agency literature, there's more contextually focused arguments about, more ethnographically informed accounts of restricted agency or agency in tight corners, as John Lonsdale would have it. And this strand of literature seeks to overcome this explanatory simplification that denies agency, but it's also criticized for maybe over-celebrating agency, that giving too much power to agency when it happens in context where there's actually limited room for influencing power and negotiating power. And I think that both of them in different ways speaks to this asymmetrical relation between vigilante groups and various forms of state actors that has more or a different kind of formally sanctioned power and authority. Right? So there's something here to gain, or there's something that is not entirely explained. So while these contributions, they're quite valuable insofar as they explain the relation and the situation, and maybe to some extent also a certain temporality about agency, I don't think they really explain the characteristics of agency. What are the qualities of agency? What are the lasting dimension of how vigilante agency is practiced, how it's coming about? And I think, or I'll try to argue at least, that the parasitic agency allows for some lasting effects. We can see it that how something new emerges, and it's often situated also in unstable contexts. Doesn't mean that it's state failure, but something is in transformation, in a period of transformation or situation of transformation in one form or the other. So in this sense, parasitic agency also allows for temporary shift in the power relations. And it's a perspective on disruption and change by asking these questions: who's actually feeding on who, and what emerges out of that, and who's feeding on who in which situations. So in that sense, parasitic agency is a specific kind of agency that relates to asymmetrical relations involving violence or struggles over power. And in the general perception of parasites, it evokes some normative dimension, right? That somebody is violently eating the host. I mean, that is hard to consider as something positive. But if we include this more kind of relational and shifting, the open question about who's actually in control in this moment, it moves it beyond the normative dimension where one is necessarily preying on the other. Leaving that as an open question, it invites us to explore how these relations unfold. Maybe somewhat similar to the processual approach as suggested by Melina. Not that she's involved in this, but so this is basically what I tried to say, that the interruption and emergence of new orders as the outcome of parasitic processes, that is quite useful for understanding vigilante action. And in this sense, it offers a situated yet extended and somewhat open-ended perspective for understanding how violent groups act and relate to state actors. And then if we think about the applicability, then maybe think about former President US Trump. I mean, how he is often quite documented incidents about how he encourages his supporters to take the law into their own hands, how he speaks in support of various armed groups like the Proud Boys. But this is quite open, a question about how much control does he have, how much they act on their own behavior, following their own agenda. And also, even though Trump's ideas about changing society and certain norms in the US has pushed an agenda, there's also a question that, were they there already, and which role do vigilante groups and armed groups in various expressions play into that? What role do they play in changing these norms and social orders? Final example could be Lawrence Bakker's examples of the ORMAS or the Brigada Maguni, where we've seen, again, quite asymmetrical relation, right? That they're displaying their capacity for violence while demonstrating their services to a moral order, right? They're acting with impunity, yet there's a shimmering uncertainty about the political control of these groupings. So these are just two examples, one from US and one from Indonesia, that where maybe this idea of parasitic agency that captures asymmetry, violent agency, and relationality that can explain these type of actions. I'll end here for listening in and looking at my moves.
Thank you so much, Jacob. And I think it was very clear what you meant with a brilliant presentation without a PowerPoint. So it worked very well. Thank you very much. And also for already actually connecting not just your own theoretical observations, but also connecting it to the other presentations that we saw earlier, and give us some examples to think with beyond your own case. So thank you very much for this contribution. We are also very happy to have here today our discussant, that is David Pratten. David Pratten is Associate Professor in Social Anthropology of Africa at the University of Oxford. And his research has examined issues of youth democracy and disorder in post-colonial Nigeria, but he's also very known as one author who has written and reflected a lot on vigilantism. So he has published extensively on vigilantism in the past, and he's also one of the editors of the seminal work Global Vigilantisms, Vigilantes Perspectives on Justice and Violence. We are very happy that he could join us today and that he can start off the discussion of these wonderful papers. David, please take the screen.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you ever so much for this very kind invitation to participate, and thank you very much to the panelists for wonderfully rich papers. As someone mentioned earlier, it's lovely to see friends and colleagues here, wherever here is. So I thought this was a really wonderful way of introducing the workshop around this conceptualizing vigilantism heading for this first panel. Clearly, these papers move us away from providing an overly neat, static definition of vigilance and vigilantism. These papers are clearly about a process that moves beyond stereotypes and easy definitions that are then probed, critiqued, reassembled, and resituated. Indeed, as the panelists have been discussing, it's long been accepted now that categories or boundaries between state and non-state, public and private, revolutionary and conservative are shot through with contradictions when we use vigilantism as a lens on law and order, security and society. And as this lens, vigilantes then offer an often out of focus, shadowy and unstable image, but which snaps momentarily into view, as in these papers, offering an index of the state of play of global policing economies, as well as local moral economies, and capturing the tactics and strategies of defining and defending against existential insecurities. So what do these papers tell us? What do we take away from Melina's work on self-defense groups and violence in Burkina, and Lauren's and Naomi's work on the comparison between Kenya and Indonesia and these complicities of vigilante groups and policing, and on Jakob's work on Mungiki as a political and security body entangled with political actors in Kenya. I think just to make one overarching comment about the commonalities, the links between these papers, it is to see a key strength in terms of this sort of revisiting the definitions in their emphasis on the relational quality or the relational perspective on vigilantism here. For Melina, this is a space of intersubjectivity. These relations are familiar, they're intimate. For Lawrence and for Naomi, this is framed as vigilant relationalities. It's shaped by collaborations with police forces. And for Jakob, this is embedded in the dyadic relations and tensions of patron-client relations. So there's something very important here, I think, in this collection that emphasizes the relational nature of vigilante movements, groups, as these intermediaries, cutting across intimate, institutional, and ideological relations, not then within metaphors of space, but across networks of relations. And it seems to me very important to emphasize that the multiplicity of roles performed by these vigilante groups, the ways in which vigilante groups are implicated across social, economic, and political contexts, simply adds layers to precisely these relations beyond policing then, and across different registers of legitimacy, implicating them within modes of understanding popular violence, popular legitimacy, yet further. So I think that's the important really takeaway of this panel. But I had a kind of comment and a few questions. The first comment, I think, is simply, especially at the beginning of a workshop like this, to focus a little on, which does come through in the texts of these papers, the kind of ethical dilemmas that we confront as anthropologists working in these contexts of violence, witnessing punishment, being aware of complicities, but associating ourselves on particular sides, or, and this especially comes through in Naomi's work, actually working with activist groups. So this positionality of the anthropologist, as it were, I think is something to keep bearing in mind. And I had just 3 questions really. I thought to start with that, of course, each paper here stresses the agency of vigilantes and vigilante groups. They narrate histories of the past and trajectories of the future in very dynamic framings, which of course is quite right. But where do vigilantes themselves see themselves going? Where is the self-narration from vigilante members themselves? So that was the first. We're very good at analysing agency, I think, as anthropologists, but capturing that self-narration, I think, is trickier. The second question is that each of the papers here stress the impunity of violence, and I think I'm in my own work, I'm very guilty of emphasising the ways in which there's a sort of spiralling, intractable popular legitimacy of punishment and violence. But I think we also have to ask where the limits are to this, and we heard something of this in the papers. Where does critique and limit emerge? Where are the triggers to this? And do movements, I mean, I work in Nigeria, do movements like End SARS, the hashtag popular resistance movement against police brutality, actually have any effect? Are these the kind of limits that we're looking at? And the final question was that I'm just thinking back to this title, Reconceptualizing Vigilantism. Clearly these papers take us a very long way from cattle rustling and sungu-sungu. But isn't a lot of what we hear about in relation to vigilantism still about making boundaries? Aren't these frontiers of identity, gender, violence, power, rights, community, sovereignty, and self that are being defined and defended? And so my question is there mileage still left in Ray Abrahams's conceptualization of vigilantism as a frontier phenomenon? So I hand you back to Martin. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David, for raising these 3 questions, but also raising the question of positionality and ethical discussions that we indeed should keep in mind, and also giving us the kind of a grander narrative or questions about the narrative, like specifically the first question about can we also say something about their own imaginations where they are heading? And I think this is a very interesting question among the others. So what I suggest is that I would like to give every presenter about 3 minutes. So it's short, but I'm going to try and keep you short so that we can also open the floor. If you feel that afterwards you would still like to get back to David's questions, please do so at a later stage. But in order to give the audience members some time, or maybe you yourself, to ask each other questions, I think we should limit your answers a little bit. And I would suggest that we start in the order of appearance. And please, Melina, would you care to respond to David's questions and comments?
Yes, thank you very much, David, and also to the others for this very interesting and inspiring presentations and comments. Well, I mean, your thoughts, David, I think they take some time to think about as well, but I would like to refer maybe to the aspect of the ethical dilemmas, because in the written paper I sent in, I do a quite long reflection also on my own positionality in the field. And actually, the main reason how I came to use violence more explicitly in my research is that I did encounter some violent punishments, not that much until now, luckily, but one particular situation kind of caught me by surprise. And by being there and by also emotionally reacting to this witnessing, I realized how relational violence is also in this situation, and how it is really something that is happening in an intersubjective space, and that I become kind of part of this violence by being there. And this kind of made me realize that without making violence an explicit aspect in this research, I'm kind of putting a big blind spot or creating a big blind spot that poses even bigger ethical and methodological and epistemological issues. And this kind of also brings me to maybe the third question you were asking. I also thought a lot about this idea of the frontier phenomenon, and it is particularly in relation to the questions of the illegitimacy and legitimacy of violence that I think it would be more suitable, and I think Ray Abrahamson also, he republished an older article where he also uses the concept of the twilight. I think it's a twilight phenomenon that kind of makes it very difficult to overcome some ambivalences, norm-related ambivalences, ethical ambivalences. They are kind of indissoluble, for me at least at the moment. And so I don't see a lot of frontier or boundary in my research. I more see it as a twilight, not only for me, also for the Koglweogo themselves, also for the population, and for everyone who seems to engage in their space, shows and communicates this ambivalence. And this is why I would probably go for the twilight phenomenon at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Melina. And if you later on want to get back to the other two questions, please do so. But I think first I would kindly give the floor to Naomi. Please, if you want to respond.
Thank you very much. I actually also start to record. Since Jacob started dancing, I started to record on my phone. I know this is also recorded, but sometimes it's nice when you walk in the woods and just to have all these very insightful questions and feedback. And I'm going to try also, I'll start with ethical dilemmas, because I've had to live through many ethical dilemmas. And I think one of the ways that I try to navigate it, which also then ties into the second point you made, which is about the self-narration. I actually started to do community-led research and action with these groups. So actually these groups themselves do research, and I sort of do ethnographic research in complementary to what they're doing. And actually since COVID, I'm doing more, I'm actually facilitating their community-led research and action. So we have like weekly meetings on Zoom, which is awesome right now. I could never have fathomed that before, but right now every Saturday morning we start with these groups on Zoom, and they actually have their own research analysis ongoing, and I think therefore I'm much more in tune with what they perceive as violence and impunity. And when I mentioned earlier on, when I said, so vigilance is not always considered violence. So, and punishment is quite a justified way of, and there are all kinds of boundaries, of course, negotiated there, and they shift. But I think with the self-narration, I think at least, which is a bit of a different approach, but at least it has helped me to understand both their own way of thinking about vigilance, about their own position in these relationalities, and also how and where they see themselves in the future. And what is very interesting in these settings, actually, that they all want to leave the group, right? So that's something. So they don't want to do this type of. So the first goal is to live beyond 25. So that's when you're 25, you're actually sort of like a grandfather. That means that you've not been killed by police. So that's, of course, that's a very tenuous relationship with police units. And then the second thing is you have to become independent from the base. And then the groups start to, so then either you become a sort of a more established community-based organization, or you become more independent in your own other hustles or businesses. This future narrative that they have has actually changed over the past 20 years. And you can actually see the way the state has clamped down on Mungiki has also had an effect on how they perceive their own groups in future. So I think that is a very important historical context. Interestingly, they still do call themselves sometimes Sungu-Sungu, especially on the coast, but these are not the Sungu-Sungu that were there also about 20 years ago. So these groups hardly evolve into more established organizations, apart from the heroin trade networks that are on the coast. So that's, of course, a very different context that we don't have time to go in there now, but that's an article that we still need to write, Jacob. And the other, about social justice activists, because many of the groups, and David, you pointed that out correctly, are also tied to the social justice movement. And I actually had 2 weeks ago, we had a talk with some of the activists from the Right to Life Committee, and the Uprising is also an active member in doing research on documenting police killings. And because the police killings have discontinued, they kind of feel like we've been doing this work for the past 5 years, we're continuing being killed, and we don't see any effect. So they're actually re-strategizing on what to do. The next Saba Saba, which is on the 7th of July, it's going to be the 4th demonstration that they're going to organize. They want to have a new strategy in place. So I'm actually really keenly following. I have no clue where it will end up with, but I definitely will share it with you. But there is also a lack of hope in that, at least police reform will happen, and they are talking about reform from below, which is a very current issue right now, as Madar right now is under military occupation, and they kind of refer to Palestine in that way, a very deliberate referral there. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Naomi.
Yes, thank you. And thank you very much, David. Really good comments and questions. Maybe to start with this idea of impunity of violence and the other, what kind of popular legitimacy, I think it depends on, impunity. Is that a formally legally sanctioned thing where there's a set boundary, so to speak, of what types of violence can be sanctioned? Or is it the more kind of fluid popular legitimacy that is also present in Lauren's example of how there's a certain shift? So it's also, I think, impunity has a very relational dimension to it, because it's about how are the actions, the violent actions and other services of vigilante groups, how are they perceived by the public, right? So when is it too much? When are they too violent, or when is their violence too publicly visible? Then they lose their authority, or there's a risk of that. And the same thing, or similar kind of argument to the point about making boundaries, because of course, I would argue, maybe with Abrams, that yes, it's still a boundary phenomenon, and especially if we think of it, the frontier. The frontier doesn't exist in itself; it relates to a center, right? So in his use of the frontier term, it's also a central point in his work, this relational dimension that comes out in both my own attempt and also Melina and Lawrence and Naomi's, because it kind of speaks to how this relation is practiced. And it is very much practiced not only in how they negotiate, but also how violence is perceived by the public that is outside the relation of the vigilante state authority negotiation. So they provide some kind of context for that, I would argue. Maybe that's too much of an loose elaboration. But I think there's also a dimension to the violence that concerns escaping state involvement, right? So there's a lot of internal violence, or violence where vigilantes sanction in the local community, but to avoid formal state intervention. So in that sense, there's an impunity from state action, but there's actually a sanctioning of some kind of misconduct. So in that sense, there are aspects to it, or we can find examples where it's much more nuanced, and maybe there are several layers of violence that produce different logics and maybe different understandings of what impunity is. I'll stop here.
Okay, thanks, Jacob. Laurens, please respond.
Yeah, thanks, Martijn, and thanks, David, for these interesting remarks and questions. And yeah, there's a lot to be said about it. I guess that my first comment pertains to indeed the amount of violence and the status of violence. And looking at the Indonesian situation, there seems to be this dynamic and highly localized, if you like, way of defining how much violence is necessary. Most of the time, these vigilantes in Indonesia hardly use any violence. Firstly, because of course it's society doesn't like it very much. Secondly, it tends to be a bit embarrassing to those in charge of using violence in society, which would be the police and the army. And there's a lot that can be said about the Indonesian state, but it is not a weak state, particularly not these two. And for instance, the case I mentioned in which some of these Ormas members beat up police officers, it was very important that it happened kind of like in the twilight situation of being not recognizable as Ormas members and police officers, and not being fully visible, and not being given much attention to, and with kind of permission from the chief of police in order to make that go. Otherwise, if you embarrass these officials too much, you're going to get a backlash, and that's not a very good idea. So a lot of what they do deals with the threat of violence, if you like, and the right amount, to put it that way. Perhaps in a sense to refer to Jacob's parasites in that sense. Again, in East Kalimantan, another group who's from an indigenous population that maintains to be the original population and to have therefore rights to the lands. They make a big case out of the many plantations that are located in the province, which is on our lands. And because it's our land, we are entitled to receive some of the profits. And officially they're not. So basically what they do, they go up to the plantations, threaten that something nasty will happen to them, like a fire or so, and hence receive some money. And they say like, well, this is where the parasites come in. We are like mosquitoes. We stick a bit and we are a bit annoying, and we need to be that, because if we're not being annoying, we're not getting noticed. And we suck a bit of blood. That's our share. That's our share of the profits that we get. But if we get too annoying, those companies will complain to government, and they will step in and swat us, flatten us. So we need to be quite careful about what we do exactly. And if it suffices to make noise without stinging, that's so much the better. And we stick with that. And on this border frontier question, I was thinking about it quite a lot as well. And I think to some extent, many of these groups, at least the ones I know, do point out some sort of a frontier, but not one in the sense of thou shalt never pass, but rather one like, hi, nice that you're there, come on in, but we're custom. Would you mind just paying a bit of this, or signing a treaty here or there, and kind of making sure that they can profit from where things are going and who's entering and who's going out in that sense. So definitely there's a dynamism there, but there is a dynamism with a bit of a stop that makes sure that they are getting noticed and that's they profit from who's passing by. And one final remark, if I may, that's ethical dilemmas element. I mean, just while thinking about it, I dug up my rings of office, to put it that way. I didn't mention that, but I actually am the official Brigade Maguni representative in the Netherlands. Not because I asked to be, I was told that I am by Brigade Maguni, basically, at one point. And this is something that happens more often in the way in which they kind of enlist or ensnare people. They basically make it known that you are being, what's the word for that? You have been decided to be an honorary member, or in my case, a representative overseas. And you're not asked, you're being told after the fact, basically, and then that is what it is. And so there's not much you can do about it. Luckily, I am not a very important local official, of course, for whom that might have repercussions. And it did not really go much further beyond some Facebook pages and me getting this stuff as proof a bit later when I came by. But imagine what this would do if I would apply for a visa for Indonesia, and this would be something that would be high up on the lists of, let's say, customs. Again, they may want to ask me some questions. For the record, I have not set up any local chapter. I am not enlisting any people, so there is no Brigade Maguni as far as I'm aware here. But it's one of the curious ways in which indeed doing this type of research also engages with your private life. Let me stop here for the moment.
Thank you, Laurens, also for this confession. I didn't know. I'll be a bit more vigilant when I'm around you, probably in the future. I think this is time for us to open